On the cracked asphalt of Highway 67, the night smelled of rain and burning rubber. The world was fractured into flashing red and blue, the strobes painting the twisted wreck of a sedan in a cruel rhythm. A man lay sprawled across the yellow divider line, chest rising in shallow bursts, blood seeping into the grit beneath him. Somewhere beyond the chaos, a truck's horn blared in protest, traffic backed up for miles. In the center of it all, a woman knelt, her gloved hands steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't glance toward the gathering crowd. Her focus was absolute. Someone barked an order at her, harsh and impatient. She didn't respond. Her name was Claire Dalton, a paramedic whose reputation in the service was whispered about with a mix of awe and frustration. The awe came from those who had watched her pull breath back into the dying, from those who had seen her walk into fire without hesitation. The frustration came from those who thought she took too many risks, bent too many rules. Tonight, those rules were on the verge of breaking entirely. A uniformed officer stepped closer, hand hovering near his belt, his voice colder this time. He told her to stand down. She stayed on her knees, fingers compressing the man's wound, her eyes never leaving the task. Bystanders shifted uncomfortably. Some lifted phones, recording the standoff between authority and a woman who refused to yield. They didn't know her history, how every moment on the job was shadowed by the echo of a desert wind and the low thud of distant artillery. Years before the ambulance, she had worn another uniform, heavier, dust-stained, with her name stitched above her heart in fading thread. She had been a combat medic in a war, where seconds meant lives, where hesitation was another word for death. She remembered the heat, the metallic taste of sand whipped into her teeth, the sound of her own breath inside her helmet, as she pressed gauze into the belly of a soldier who would never see home again. The military had taught her how to work under fire, how to ignore chaos, and most of all, how to hold her silence when it spoke louder than any words. But silence came with a cost. Back home, she had carried the weight of those she couldn't save. Some nights she woke, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if she were still on the battlefield. And yet, when the call came over the radio about a crash on the highway, she answered without thinking. She didn't think about the politics, or the people who believed paramedics should follow every chain of command without question. She thought only of the pulse fluttering under her fingers now, fading with each drop of blood. The officer's voice grew louder, sharper. He insisted she stop, that the scene was unsafe, that she was violating protocol. Claire's partner, standing just behind her, shifted nervously but said nothing. Around them, the crowd's murmurs swelled and broke like waves. A woman in the front row clutched her child's shoulder and pulled him back. A man muttered something about liability. No one stepped forward to help. No one challenged the officer. Claire felt the familiar isolation, the moment before a decision when the world seemed to hold its breath. She kept working. The man's breathing slowed, his lips turning pale. Her training told her what had to happen next, but it was going to push her well past the line drawn by policy. Somewhere in her mind, she heard a voice, not from this night, but from years ago, in a tent hospital thick with the smell of iodine and diesel. It was her old commanding officer, speaking low, telling her that saving a life wasn't about permission. It was about being able to live with yourself afterward. When she reached for the airway kit, the officer stepped in front of her, blocking the light. His shadow fell across the patient's face. Still, she didn't speak. She adjusted her position, her movements deliberate, unhurried. It was the kind of calm that unnerved people, because it meant she was certain. A flash of recognition crossed the officer's expression, though he tried to mask it. Something about her eyes made him hesitate, as if he was looking at someone who had stood in places far worse than a wet stretch of highway. In the periphery, a shape moved, a man stepping from the crowd, his coat zipped high against the cold. He said nothing as he pulled a badge from his pocket and held it up to the officer's face. A detective, off duty. He didn't need to speak either. The silence between the two men was enough. The officer stepped back. The detective crouched beside Claire and offered a hand to stabilize the airway. She accepted without looking up. her focus still locked on the man beneath her. Minutes stretched and folded until finally, the patient drew a deeper breath, his chest lifting more fully. The blood slowed under her compressions. Relief didn't show on her face. She had learned long ago not to let hope in too early, but her hands eased fractionally. She glanced at the detective, and in that exchange there was an entire conversation. Gratitude, recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to defy for the sake of saving. Later, when the ambulance doors closed and the night air thinned around the scene, the officer didn't meet her gaze. He didn't apologize. But as the rig pulled away, the crowd shifted. The woman who had clutched her child now stood a little taller. A man near the back lowered his phone and placed it in his pocket. People moved aside, not because they were told to, but because something in the air demanded it. A quiet acknowledgement of a truth they all felt but couldn't name. Claire leaned back in her seat for the first time, gloves streaked with crimson, her hair damp from the mist. The detective's card sat on the bench beside her, a silent reminder that even in moments of isolation, unseen allies existed. She thought about the line the officer had tried to draw, the invisible fence between protocol and humanity. Some rules protected people, others protected power, and she knew exactly which side of that fence she would stand on every time. In the days that followed, the story surfaced online. The videos, shaky but clear enough, showed a paramedic refusing to abandon a dying man. Comments poured in, some praising her courage, others condemning her defiance. None of that mattered to her. What mattered was the patient, now stable in a hospital bed, breathing on his own. What mattered was that, for all the noise, she had kept her silence until the moment it was needed most, because silence wasn't absence. It was presence, distilled. It was the weight of every decision she'd ever made in the field, the sum of every life saved and every life lost. It was the quiet conviction that the measure of a person wasn't in the orders they followed, but in the lives they protected when no one else would step forward. And it was that silence, unshaken and immovable, that had turned a tense standoff on a rain-slicked highway into a moment of undeniable truth.